Hey everybody, it's Friday. You have officially made it to the end of e-learning week. Hopefully everybody is still alive and healthy at this point. Again, you should be watching this on Friday, so by now you should already have watched the video and completed everything, knowing the difference between a progressive and a flat income tax. You should know the other types of taxes too. We talked about gas tax, bag tax, sin tax. And you should also have completed your write-up about advocating either for or against a progressive income tax, which is Governor J.B. Pritzker's plan. If you've done that already, then you are definitely on track. We're going to be moving on just a little bit today, talking a little bit more about taxes, but also completing your knowledge of the business cycle that you had from last unit. Because if you remember, hopefully this graph should look very familiar to you at this point. And if you remember on your notes, there was like other numbers on there that we didn't go over yet, and I said that we were going to go over them eventually. I'm fulfilling on my promises. So if we look at our business cycle here, so we've got real GDP on one axis, time. This should look familiar to you. The booms and busts, the ups and downs that the economy naturally goes through. And if I were to label these, which you were able to do on your quiz, you did pretty well on your quiz for Monday, so I'm very happy with you all. We should be able to lead these. So all the way at the top here, our highest point, this is our peak of the business cycle. Here at the bottom, this is our trough of the business cycle. And I know that you would also be able to label expansion and recession in here. You have already showed me that you know how to do that. But the one part that we have not yet talked about is these like in-between gaps. So in between like this line of our general trend of GDP, it's going up over time, so this country would be happy because there is economic growth, because this trend line is upwards. But what's going on in like this in-between section? In between our peak there and in between our trough here, there's these gaps. And these gaps have names, and they are going to relate to what we're going to be jumping into a little bit today, and then definitely after our extended spring break. So you should know this on here. You should be able to label these, and if you've got your Google Doc open, I'm looking at mine over here. Your first gap that's labeled in here. Actually, I'm going to skip the first one. Go straight to the second one with me that we're going to label here. This one here makes a lot of sense to me. This one is called a recessionary gap. To me, this one makes the most sense, a recessionary gap, because we'll look at where this gap is. It's at the end of a recession and it's by the trough. So if you already know the phases of the business cycle, this should generally make sense to you. This is a recessionary gap because it's right here. We've got recession and trough, and you could look to see even part of recovery is also part of this recessionary gap. And really just recessionary gap, what it just means is we are, as a country, are not meeting our potential for GDP. So we have a potential GDP, and you can see during a recession, not all workers are working because unemployment is high. It's the highest that it is at the trough. So we're not producing as much as we can, and if we're not producing as much as we can, then we're not living up to our potential of the full GDP. That's what this line indicates. So here we're not living up to how much we actually could be producing as a nation. And recessionary gaps, I think you can know why these can be problematic. During recessions, people lose their jobs. If you don't have a job, then you don't have money. So there's a question on there also on your Google Doc. What are some problems associated with the recessionary gap? Well, we're not living up to our potential GDP production, like our production, the maximum that we could be producing as a country. And just as a general, talking about real people, during a recessionary gap and during a recession, people are losing their jobs and they're losing money. And then this top gap here, you might say, well, this sounds so bad. If this is a recessionary gap, then this might be a good thing. But this is also actually a bad gap over here. So this one, this one is labeled as number 1 on your Google Doc. This one is called an inflationary gap. Which hopefully this is not, should make some sense to you as well, because during a recovery or an expansion, inflation and prices are going up, and at a peak, inflation prices are at the highest that they're going to be. So it makes sense that this part here that fills in, that hits the peak here and is mostly expansion here, we're calling this the inflationary gap. And during this time, we're actually producing a little bit more than our potential GDP, which might seem weird, but we're actually producing outside of our production possibilities curve. And this might be temporary investment, or it's such low unemployment that businesses are eventually going to have to start competing and paying more, and then we're going to have to reach a peak and we're going to have a recession. So we're actually temporarily operating outside of our maximum GDP, which it's funny because then it's not our maximum, but we know that it's going to come back down to it. And problems associated with an inflationary gap then, we're producing outside of GDP and we know it's going to come down. And this idea too of, think about this, if prices are continuing to go up, if you were going to the grocery store and your usual bill is $50, but then a year later it's $100, and a year later it's $150. So prices of things are going up, but the money that you have saved in the bank is not gaining any value. So even though you're getting the same things, if you buy the exact same groceries all the time, but the prices just keep going up, the money that you have saved in the bank is not going up. So you're going to deplete your money more quickly when there's high inflation. So you're not getting any more money that way, and you're just spending more money for the same things that you were buying for less money in the past. So you can see why an inflationary gap is also an issue here. So the question is what can we do to ease these gaps? And like we were talking about at the end of Unit 3, way back when we were actually in school, is what can we do to kind of squeeze the business cycle so that the highs aren't so high and that the lows aren't so low, and we can get as close as we can to this flat line trend, because that just seems like it would be easier. And the answer to that is, one of the answers is fiscal policy, and that's what we're going to be starting with today. And fiscal policy, for that third question on your Google Doc there, who controls fiscal policy? We're talking about the government here. We're talking about Congress will pass laws, and then the president will sign them into law. Your little government lesson here. But we're talking definitely about the government here. We're going to talk specifically about the two ways that the government is doing that and what they do during inflationary gaps and what they do during recessionary gaps. So let's take a look at fiscal policy as a response by the government. Remember, the government is the people who are in charge of fiscal policy. So if they see the economy and they see that it's, we're growing really fast or we're in a recession, then the fiscal policy is how the government responds. It's like, all right, how can we smooth out those curves? So if we first have to think about then, all right, if the government are the people in charge, what do they have control over that they can do to help regulate the economy? And so there's two big things that make sure you've got this on your Google Doc that you're going to submit. The first thing that the government do and the first thing that they control is they can control taxes. And this is, federal income taxes, this is taxes on businesses, taxes on money that you make out of the stock market, all types of taxes. But Congress has the power to levy taxes in America, so they can change those policies based on how the government is going. They can raise, lower, keep the same, whatever. That's all the government's prerogative. So they can control taxes, and then they can also control government spending. So the government can decide who is getting their money where, and I'm sure that you've seen charts or something of how much money in the nation's budget is going to the military, how much is going to health and human services, and how much is going to education and things like that. Congress gets to decide that, and then the president signs that into law. So these are the two things that the federal government definitely has control over. So when they see the economy going up or down, they're going to use these two tools to help balance it out. So let's take a look then back at recessionary gap and inflationary gaps, which you should have the definitions of these already. So if I were to ask you what's going on in the economy during a recessionary gap, you should be able to tell me, because a recessionary gap, we're talking about that dip and that bottom part and a little bit of that recovery of the business cycle. So if I were to ask, say, like, hey, what's going on to GDP during a recessionary gap, you'd say, GDP is kind of sucking, or it's going down, or it's not where it needs to be. We have that output gap, right? We're not reaching our full potential. We could be producing even more. So our GDP is lower than our maximum. I think that you can see where I'm going with this, that we were going to go, of course, to unemployment. Unemployment is high at our trough, is where unemployment is the highest that it's ever going to be. And then our prices are going down. The goal of the government then is to shift these. If GDP is going down, they want to lift it up. If unemployment is going up, they want to bring it down. And if prices are going down, they want to lift them up. Of course, like prices, they don't want to make everything super expensive, but they just want as much as they can. Remember, in that business cycle, they want to stick to that straight line as much as possible. So if prices are too low, they want to bring those just to a normal average level. So the question is then, if this is what's happening during a recessionary gap, what can the government do using these two tools to help balance this out? Well, let's think about this for a sec. If GDP is going down, there's not enough production. Let's say there's factories in Illinois that just don't have the resources. It's a recessionary gap. They've run out of money, and so they have to lay off workers, and they just can't produce as much as they were anymore. Well, that's definitely affecting GDP. They're not producing as much as they were. What Congress can do and what the federal government can do is say, listen, we control government spending. So Congress might pass a bill and say, factories in Illinois, businesses, we see that you're struggling and having issues, so we're going to pass a bill that, you may have heard this term before, like a stimulus package or something for these factories, so that we can help you out. We're going to give you a little bit more capital, a little bit more money, so that you can continue producing in hopes then that that will help raise GDP. So what can the government do during a recessionary gap? They can increase government spending, and you can see how that might help, businesses and firms. But then the second tool, taxes. So if they also want, during a recessionary gap, unemployment is really high at the trough, unemployment is at the highest it's ever going to be, Americans are losing money, right? If you don't have a job, you're not making money. So what's one way that the government can kind of indirectly give money back to the American people in the hopes that they'll take that money and, go spend it at the grocery store and get the economy, let's get some growth going again. And so the one way they can do that is they're going to decrease taxes. Hey, if you have to pay less in taxes, that means you'll have a little bit more money, right? So these are the two strategies of increasing government spending, decreasing taxes. And what's important to know is that here the economy is going to slow. So the government wants to boost it up. It wants to help expand. So what's important about this then is you should know is this is called expansionary fiscal policy. And I think that makes sense. During a recession, the government wants to respond and they want to do the opposite. So when the economy is receding, they want to fix that and they want to make it expand. So they've got expansionary fiscal policy. So if you're following with this here, which I hope that you are on track here. So let's look then during an inflationary gap. When the economy is kind of going too fast, it's really hot. Things are going great in the American economy. What's going on? Well, let's do the same thing that we talked about over here. Let's talk about GDP. GDP is high, it's going up. At the peak, it's the highest it's ever going to be. Unemployment is low. And prices are going up, they're high. The problem with this then, this might not seem like a problem. Hey, GDP is really high, unemployment is really low. Like, why would the government want to intervene with that? And it all just has to do with that booms and busts of the business cycles, because they know if GDP is going to get really high, then as soon as that trough comes, the GDP is going to hit really low. Unemployment gets too low, eventually unemployment is going to get really high. It's always going to even out itself that way. So it's just trying to mush these things. They're not trying to stop GDP, stop productions, or, they're not wanting people to get fired or anything like that, but they're just trying to make it as controlled as possible. So let's see, using the two tools that government's doing, if they're saying, hey, the economy is growing too fast, we need to kind of cool it off, otherwise we don't know where this is going to go, recession. So one thing that they can do, they could do this to businesses or everyday people, is they can increase taxes. You're taking money outside of the market. All of this money that people might be spending, on vacations and cruises, if they have to increase taxes, maybe they won't do that anymore. That's going to slow the economy down just a little bit. And the same thing on businesses. Increase these taxes. You're kind of producing too much. You're producing outside of that production possibilities curve. We know that that's going to be an issue. So they're going to increase taxes on people, and then they're going to do the opposite of what they're doing over here. So if they're here during a recessionary gap, you want to decrease taxes to stimulate the economy. Here you want to increase taxes to kind of slow down the economy, and you're also then going to decrease government spending. Because, hey, those factories in Illinois, if the economy is growing really fast, they don't need the government's money anymore. So the government can take that back and kind of slow down the economy that way. That might slow down our output, slow down our production a little bit, but that's the goal. We want to smooth out those curves as much as possible. So then, if this was expansionary fiscal policy, you wanted to expand the government during a receding economy, over here you kind of want to slow down the economy when it's growing too fast. So this is called contractionary fiscal policy. Contraction, you can read that. And we see this happening right now with all of the, thank you for doing the assignments last week about, while I was gone, about the coronavirus, but you could see the economy is struggling. It doesn't really know how to handle this. And you better believe that the federal government right now is taking a look at actions and is saying, listen, we think we might be reaching some type of recessionary gap. The economy is really slowing down. So how can the federal government respond to kind of speed up the economy, make people feel more confident, give people a little bit more money to spend? And you better believe one of the things that the president is actually proposing is cutting what's called the payroll tax. He's saying we need to reduce taxes because I want to stimulate the economy. That's an example of expansionary fiscal policy. So this is something that definitely is still going on. So from this part of the video, you should be able to tell me what are the two methods, the two strategies that the government can do to kind of control the economy. And that's, they've got control of taxes and government spending. And then you should be able to tell me, what is the government going to do during a recessionary gap? They're going to increase government spending, they're going to decrease taxes, and that's called expansionary fiscal policy. If you've got that, you're good. And then during an inflationary gap, when the economy is growing too fast and the government's kind of worried, they're going to increase taxes and decrease government spending, and that's called contractionary fiscal policy, trying to take those really highs and just shrink them down a little bit. Hey, I just wanted to come back for a quick sec if you were struggling with this. I know this is a lot of new content to be doing on an e-learning week on the Friday before spring break, and this is very mean of me, but if you can remember any of this over spring break, I will be very happy with you. But I just wanted to quickly talk about if this is all confusing to you, or if it's hard to see what's important, what you need to remember, and what you don't need to remember, here are the big things. Basically, just the things on this board that we started with. So if you can define for me what a recessionary gap is, you're good. And an inflationary gap. Those two types of gaps, hopefully by the end of today, you've got those. If you can explain to me the two strategies that the government has that they can use to help control the economy, taxes and government spending, that's awesome. So the two types of gaps, the two strategies that the government can do, and then how they enact these strategies with the different types of gaps and what type of fiscal policy that is, you're totally on track and you're doing awesome. If it's confusing to you which type of gap matches with which type of fiscal policy, so during an inflationary gap, a government will use contractionary fiscal policy. During a recessionary gap, a government will use expansionary fiscal policy. One, I think it just makes logical sense. During a recession, the government wants to expand. During too much expansion, the government wants to contract. But also, I use silly mnemonics to help myself all the time. And this is the one that helps me. It's just, I see which one it is. Inflationary matches with contractionary, I and C. Those two go together, and then these two just end up together because that's what's left, R and E. But I see it. I see that it's inflationary and contractionary that go together. Yeah, that's all I have. If you complete your Google Doc then, hopefully going through these videos together and these notes together is helpful to you. I also put on the Google Slides, there's a good review video, the first 4-ish minutes of a crash course video that I think are pretty helpful. But then if you just get this and submit it, you're done for the week. You have 2 weeks off. Enjoy your spring break. I look forward to seeing you all again very soon in April.